So we're continuing on with this sort of historical crash course to help people kind of orient to the international system and some of the major developments that have sort of played out over the last, well, I guess, 500 years. This conversation is going to focus on sort of the middle part of the 20th century, what we call the Cold War. And again, we could spend an entire course talking about the Cold War, but I want to kind of get people oriented to some of the changes in how the system operated during this period. So the Cold War really kicks off kind of at the end of World War II, where the European great powers that had dominated the international system throughout much of the 19th century with the concert of Europe and sort of global colonialism, they're breaking apart in terms of their power, their strength, and their ability to sort of dominate the international system. And the new countries that are sort of in a preeminent sort of power position, the United States and the Soviet Union, are really opposed to that sort of European colonial order and push back against it. And so over the next couple decades, you're going to see dozens upon dozens of independence movements throughout much of what we now call the developing world as colonial possessions of European powers assert their independence, break free, and become new sovereign states. And so we see an incredible transformation of the international system, going from about 55 states in the end of World War I or start of World War II to around nearly 200 states today as new countries enter into the international system. The United States and the Soviet Union really were economically and militarily dominant at the end of World War II. And so to give you a perspective, at the end of World War II, the United States was roughly one half of the global economy. One half of everything produced anywhere in the world was being produced in the United States. Of the remaining half, about half of that was being produced by the Soviet Union. So 75%-ish of the global economy is being controlled by these two states. Now, part of that is that World War II, smashed the industrial centers of many other countries. But at the end of World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union really were in an overwhelming dominant position and ended up having some intense disagreements about the nature of that post-war order, and ended up in a series of conflicts over territory in Europe and the Middle East and Asia and East Asia. But tried to avoid any sort of direct confrontation, both because they were exhausted by World War II, both because they had incredible destructive capacity initially in the form of the Red Army for the Soviet Union and the nuclear weapons for the United States, but then later in terms of both countries having large nuclear arsenals. So the idea of a direct military confrontation between the two states was very terrifying, and they sought to actively avoid it. But that competition and that rivalry played out through a series of proxy wars between the United States and the Soviet Union during this period that we call the Cold War, right? They're not fighting directly, they're fighting indirectly. And in fact, this is very, classic rivalry behavior. When you have two powerful states that don't get along, they frequently try to establish spheres of influence. And so the United States sets up a sphere of influence in sort of the Western Hemisphere, in Western Europe, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea become allies. And then other states as well, while the Soviet Union tries to cement its control over Eastern Europe, tries to assert influence into the Middle East, and tries to partner itself with the communist regime in China. And so the world ends up getting divided up between these two rival blocs, the East and the West, the Soviet Union and the United States. And much of the rest of the world that's sort of emerging from colonialism ends up being competed over during this period in terms of will states support the Soviet Union or will they support the United States. Now, initially, the United States is really uncertain how to respond to this challenge of this Soviet Union that's creating spheres of influence around the world. Initially, there was a debate within the Truman administration about maybe the United States should just withdraw from the world and sort of, let the rest of the world figure it out. Others were saying, no, the United States needs to directly confront the Soviet Union. And into that debate came George Kennan, who writes an article it's called the X article because he signs it X. He's actually a ambassador or a diplomat stationed in Moscow, and he's watching the Soviet system from the inside, and he concludes that the system is economically rotten to the core, that over time there are inefficiencies in the Soviet system that are going to compound, and while the Soviet economy looks red hot right now, a big part of that is because they're essentially looting factories from Eastern Europe But that's not going to be sustainable. And eventually, the Soviet economic machine is sort of going to grind to a halt and sort of collapse on itself. And so George Kennan argues that the United States doesn't need to defeat the Soviet Union militarily, it just needs to wait for that to happen. But in the meantime, if the Soviet Union is allowed to sort of march across the face of the earth, it may not matter. And so the job of the United States is to prevent the Soviet Union from expanding, to prevent Soviet dominance globally, and wait for the Soviet Union to collapse. And so this policy that comes out of the X article and George Kennan's sort of analysis of the situation is called the containment doctrine. And so the United States sets up a whole system of alliances, NATO in Western Europe and the Baghdad Pact and CENTO in the Middle East, that kind of creates a wall of alliances across the sort of south of the Soviet Union, and then into CETO, Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, which again binds together countries like Pakistan and I guess at the time also Bangladesh, France and Britain and their colonial holdings in the Middle East, to try to create this sort of wall to prevent Soviet influence from expanding outward. And it commits the United States through the Truman administration and then on into the Eisenhower administration to confront the Soviet Union wherever it might be, wherever it is threatening to expand its influence, which leads the United States into a whole host of conflicts that have really only indirect national security interests. And Vietnam is a good example of this, where the United States didn't necessarily have a strong need to support Vietnam outside of this story that the U.S. policymakers were telling themselves about how communism functioned like a series of dominoes, and that if Vietnam were to fall to communism, soon it would be Cambodia and Thailand and then Indonesia, and before you know it, really important, vital, strategically important countries would be threatened by communism because of this domino effect. But the United States ends up pouring, a decade worth of effort and, 50,000 plus American lives and, trillions of dollars into trying to stop the Soviet Union's perceived influence in Vietnam. And it ends up being really unsustainable. And so in the early 1970s, the United States embarks on sort of a new strategy for dealing with the Soviet Union, which is sometimes called détente, but détente actually refers to more of an engagement that was starting to take place even under the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. But Nixon really leans into this, and he puts forward sort of a two-part strategy. One part is that the United States is no longer going to commit troops to stop Soviet expansion. That if a country feels it's threatened by the Soviet Union, the United States will be there to support it diplomatically. The United States will be there to support it with cash and with guns, but you have to fight your own conflicts. So the Nixon doctrine sort of puts a limit on the scope of U.S. support in confronting the Soviet Union. The second thing that Nixon does is he reestablishes diplomatic ties with China. And China had for a long time been trying to work itself away from the Soviet Union. They had a number of conflicts over a whole range of issues. The Soviet Union tried to stop China from developing its own nuclear weapons. They had fought a border dispute. And I think in 1962, China attacks India, and the Soviet Union actually backs India at the expense of China. And so China is looking to sort of separate itself from the Soviet Union. And Nixon's able to reestablish a diplomatic relationship with China that sort of pulls China away from the Soviet Union and closer to the United States, which helps the United States sort of reassert a strategic security presence in Southeast Asia and East Asia that might have been weakened by the U.S. defeat in Vietnam. Okay, so again, we're hitting the highlights of the Cold War, but I want to talk about the 1980s and what happens in the Soviet Union in the 1980s, because the 1980s was a really bad decade for the Soviet Union. In the 1970s, a lot of what George Kennan had predicted was coming to pass. The Soviet economy was really grinding to a halt. It was inefficient, and it was struggling to do some basic things, but it helped that global oil prices were through the roof in the 1970s, and the Soviet Union was able to export oil, and they were able to use the cash that they got from that to buy consumer goods, to subsidize other countries, and to contribute, pay for foreign aid. But in the 1980s, the price of oil falls, and suddenly the Soviet Union is facing a really dire economic, contraction, and so into this sort of crisis comes Mikhail Gorbachev, who looks at the economic crisis that the Soviet Union is facing, who looks at a quagmire of a conflict in Afghanistan that the Soviet Union is struggling to pacify, and concludes that Soviet policy really needs to change. And so in 1986, he goes to the Warsaw Pact, which is sort of the alliance bloc in Eastern Europe, the sort of, I guess, mirror to NATO, and tells the members of the Warsaw Pact that from now on, if they find themselves in trouble with internal domestic problems, they cannot rely upon the Soviet Union to roll in with tanks. That in the past, if there were uprisings internally, the Soviet Union would come in and put those down and assert authority. That was no longer going to happen. But don't tell anyone that that's what's happening. And so for a couple of years, things are remaining more or less stable, and Gorbachev is trying to push forward with internal reforms within the Soviet Union, glasnost and perestroika, and opening up to the outside world, allowing information to come in a little bit more, and allowing some economic reforms. But things sort of move along as they were until the late 1980s, when things start cracking. And it happens sort of in odd places. So in Poland, there's a dock workers sort of movement known as Solidarity that's been protesting against the government, and the Polish Communist Party decides that a way to resolve this dispute is to allow for an election in which Solidarity will run against the Communist Party of Poland, and the votes come in and Solidarity wins. And so the head of the Communist Party in Poland calls up Mikhail Gorbachev, and Mikhail Gorbachev wins the Nobel Peace Prize for this conversation, in which the Polish leader says, "We lost, what do we do?" And Gorbachev says, "Concede. You lost." And suddenly, in the heart of the Warsaw Pact, there is a country that no longer is communist, that's being run by a democratically elected non-communist party, and the Soviet Union stands by. And so the word kind of goes out that maybe things are changing. In Germany, a country that had been divided by World War II, so there's East and West Germany, and Eastern Germany is, particularly in Berlin, is kind of walled off and separated from West Berlin, which is still under sort of the control of West Germany. There's a series of peace protests that start taking place. These had happened in the past and occasionally had been crushed by the government, but they start in Leipzig, which is one of the major cities in the East, and it starts just with people attending prayer vigils at a church, and the crowds start getting larger, and they start spilling out in the street, and then the organizers decide that they're going to arrange for a march through the heart of the city center. And the government says, put it down. And the Stasi, the East German secret police, move in. They tell the hospitals to prepare for bodies. They line snipers up along the perimeter of the square. And as the protesters march in, the Stasi commander says, screw it, I can't do it. And the protesters march through, and the word goes out. The regime is breaking. Shortly after that, there's miscommunication at a crossing point in Berlin between East Berlin and West Berlin, and people think they can get through, and the guards essentially shrug and say whatever. And before, where they would have shot people trying to cross into West Berlin, they just let them go. And some people cross into West Berlin, and other people run home and say the border's open. And people rush to the Berlin Wall, and they start tearing it down with hammers and whatever. And the regime is essentially cracking and breaking. And regime by regime undergoes a similar sort of transformation. In the Soviet Union, it happens in 1991. Mikhail Gorbachev is vacationing, and hardliners who are opposed to his reforms put him under house arrest and seize the Kremlin. And the nascent sort of political movements that had been allowed to sort of emerge under the glasnost and perestroika policies rally, and there's a protest in Moscow, and Boris Yeltsin sort of leads protesters against the hardliners, and the hardliners back down, and they release Gorbachev, but Gorbachev realizes that the political base, the people with weapons in the Soviet Union no longer support his policies, and he's in a really untenable position. And so on Christmas Day, 1991, he goes on state television and announces that on January 1st, 1992, the Soviet Union will cease to exist. Go your separate ways. And the Cold War is over, dramatically.